How to plan a full year of your podcast. Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 252. Thank you for joining me for the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is the award-winning how-to podcast about podcasting. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm doing this little theme during the month of January 2016, and that theme, if you couldn't figure out, is all about the new year. And we often think new year, new you, or new year, new podcast, but we should also be thinking about the coming year. Now, you may be listening to this at any time of the year, so you may not think calendar year, but instead you may want to think year as in the next 365 days of your podcast. And I want to talk to you about how to plan a full year of your podcast. In the last episode, I mentioned that one of the things I'm going to try doing with the Audacity to Podcast is to batch my recording. And in fact, today, on this day that I'm recording my podcast, I may actually be recording 2 episodes of my podcast because I'm trying to get into experimenting with batching my own recordings. And part of that involves needing to plan ahead a lot more. And that's something that I think can apply to you as well. Even if you're not planning to batch your recordings, you may still want to have a much larger plan for your podcast for the coming year. It could be that you're just starting out and you want to have that plan of how is your podcast going to survive for at least a year. Or maybe you've been podcasting for a while and you need to figure out where you're going to go for the next year, the direction of your podcast. So I have 5 steps to share with you about how to plan a full year for your podcast. Number 1, plan with a calendar because you'll learn a lot by looking at the calendar. Number 2, brainstorm an episode list so you'll know what topics or guests you want to have on your podcast. Number 3, organize your episode ideas. You'll see natural themes and ways that these fit together as well as comparing them to your calendar. Number 4, commit to a schedule. Once you have all of this information together, it's time to actually make the time for it. And number 5, be flexible because all kinds of things could come up that you want to take advantage of or things that you may not have been prepared for. If you want to follow along in the show notes for this episode, then go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/year plan. Let's get into this in depth now. Number 1, plan with a calendar. This is your first step, I think, to planning the upcoming year for your podcast. Grab a calendar. It doesn't have to be print or digital. It can be whatever. Maybe you even draft out the calendar of your regular publishing days over the next year. But it is important to look at an actual calendar because a calendar will remind you of certain dates and events coming up. Like, even though it might be very easy for you to consider, oh yeah, I'll put out a weekly episode every week of this year, you may not realize that certain times fall on holidays, or maybe during trips for you, or a day that you're planning to take off, maybe for your birthday or family travel or anything like that. So when you look at a calendar, you can start to see these are the days when my episode would publish, or these are the events near when my episode would publish. And these things may affect your podcasting, or you may simply need to be aware of them. Holidays, for example, may inspire you with certain timely ideas. And if you're going to create content that is inspired by a holiday, I recommend that you release that content before the holiday comes out instead of after or on the day of the holiday, because if you release it before, that's when most people are in that holiday spirit. They're already seeing all of the advertising for it, since it seems all of the stores are now advertising every holiday months and months in advance. So it's easier to be in the spirit of that holiday before the holiday instead of after. The same thing with your podcast. And it's also more likely people will listen to it during that holiday season if you release your episode before the holiday instead of on or after the holiday. But you might decide that that holiday inspires you with some kind of idea. Like Christmas, for example, is celebrated in most countries across the world, and most people celebrate something similar to Christmas around that time. It could be Hanukkah, it could be Kwanzaa, it could be something else, but something that is often associated with gift giving around that Christmas time. And you may decide that that's a great time to have an episode about gifts. Maybe you want to do your gift list for your audience or whatever it would be that's relevant to your audience that also fits with those holidays that could then be timely content for your podcast. Or you could even use that as an inspiration, but make it into timeless content. So even though it's themed and inspired by a holiday, someone could listen to it and enjoy it at any time, just like I've been doing with these New Year episodes that I've recently covered. I haven't only mentioned the upcoming year, but I have made it more relevant to say even whatever the next year is for you, 365 days from today, that's your upcoming year. But these holidays could also affect your schedule for your podcast. You may be motivated based on when a holiday is and when your publishing or recording schedule would be to maybe take some time off. So you postpone an episode, or you may want to still release an episode during that time, but this means you need to plan extra in order to record early and schedule that episode for automatic publishing while you're gone or while you're unavailable. When you know how your upcoming year's events look and how they'll affect your publishing schedule and your content, this can also give you that target number of episodes you'll need for the upcoming year. If you have a monthly podcast, it's pretty easy because most holidays won't conflict with the entire month, so most likely you'll know you need 12 episodes for the year. If you have a weekly podcast, you may decide to take a week or two off for certain holidays or travel or anything like that, and you decide maybe you want 50 episodes in the year or 52 episodes. If you have a daily podcast, like 5 business days per week or 7 days per week, then you'll know how many episodes that you need to plan for the upcoming year. And you can interpolate that into whatever specific publishing schedule you'd like to keep. The main thing is you know your number of episodes that you'll need for the upcoming year. And you also know what episodes coincide with certain events on the calendar that you may want to tie in with your episodes. So this is step 1, plan with a calendar. Step 2, brainstorm an episode list. Now that you know how many episodes you'll need and how holidays might affect those certain episodes, you know how many episodes you need to plan for, how many episode ideas you need to come up with. So start brainstorming for these future topics, or if you have an interview show where you have guests on, start brainstorming for what guests you want in the upcoming year. I've done a whole episode about brainstorming topic ideas for your podcast, and I have a link to that in the show notes for this episode at theaudacitypodcast.com/yearplan. The point is to make a list of as many ideas as possible. Don't try to organize this list yet, and certainly don't try to start planning out these individual episodes just yet. You may get certain inspiration, and it's fine to jot down some ideas for some of these different topics. But the point here is not to come up with an outline for every episode. It's to come up with an overall direction for your podcast and ideas that you want to use in your podcast, simply making a list of all of those ideas or all of those guests, all of those topics or tools, whatever it is that you talk about, come up with that list. Now, I know many podcasts do cover content that's time-based, so you can't really come up with a list because you don't know what will be happening then. It might be you do a TV show fan podcast and you know the publishing schedule for the TV show, so you can know that you need to have episodes during that time, but you don't know what the TV show episode will be about. That's fine. It's more important that you know when you'll be publishing and that you'll have episodes on those times. But there may be hiatuses in which you'll want to have some episodes to fill the hiatus. So then you need to plan for what are you going to talk about during the hiatus. You may also have a podcast that's based on current events and you can't see the future. So you just have to know that you're going to have an episode during these certain times and cover certain events. There may be those times when you decide to take a week off And that could be a time that you do some kind of special episode, an interview, a look back, a review of things or predictions, anything like that. And that's up to you what you want. The most important thing is where there are those blanks where you need to come up with something, brainstorm a list of ideas or guests, something to include for your podcast during that time. And if you have a weekly podcast, for example, and coming up with a list of 50 or more episodes, individual topics or guests is a bit too much of a challenge. There's nothing wrong with that, but here's a way to make it even a little bit easier, is pick monthly themes. So instead of coming up with 52 topics or 52 guests, you might need to only come up with 12 topics and 12 themes that can then be subdivided into individual episodes. For example, if I wanted to have themes of Twitter, podcasting, and finances, those are my 3 core ideas. So that's 3 months of content there. But then how does that subdivide into individual episodes? Well, for Twitter, I could do an episode on how to get started with Twitter, an episode about how to get more followers, an episode about how to automate your sharing schedule, an episode about how to manage multiple accounts. That's 4 episodes right there, a full month of content focused around that single theme of Twitter. Or podcasting, for example, since the Audacity podcast is about podcasting, maybe you want to have a theme for your show that for a whole month you're talking about the art and technique of podcasting. So for one episode, it might be how to start a podcast. The next episode is how to grow your podcast audience. Then how to monetize your podcast. Then how to get others on your podcast. That's 4 episode ideas right there underneath that one theme. Or look at finances. You could have an episode about how to make a budget, or how to overcome debt, or how to teach your kids about money, or how to plan for the future. 4 episode ideas right there under one core theme. This can be a much easier way to plan the future of your podcast and these future topics. And this can apply to guests as well. Maybe you want guests that follow along a certain theme. Maybe one month it's entrepreneurs, or maybe that's way too vague. So you want to niche down. So maybe one month it's local entrepreneurs. So you find 4 people local to you to interview for a particular month. Maybe the next month it's entrepreneurs who started as a teenager. So you find 4 entrepreneurs who started as teenagers, and that's your basic theme for that month. It's okay if you don't communicate that theme to your audience, but sometimes when you do, you'll get a lot more inspiration because you're more specific. Instead of simply saying, hey, what guest should I have on my podcast? You could say, hey, what guest do you know of who started a business before they finished high school? Then that gives you far more targeted advice and gets your audience thinking too, because instead of your audience simply thinking, entrepreneur, do I know any entrepreneurs? They might think, oh yeah, I remember a guy that started his own business while he was still in high school, and they can recommend that. So you're inspiring them to give you content as well. So when you come up with this list of themes, or this list of episodes, this gives you more direction for your podcast for the upcoming year. And it's okay that these might be all over the place. The point right now isn't to organize them, isn't to even necessarily decide which ones are worth keeping. The main point of brainstorming is simply to get ideas out there and start stretching yourself to figure out what else could you cover? Who else could you have on? What other topics might your audience be interested in? Definitely listen back to my episode about brainstorming future topics. And I have a link to that in the show notes for this episode at theaudacitypodcast.com/year-plan. That's number 2, brainstorm an episode list. Number 3, organize your episode ideas. Now that you have this list of topics or themes or guests for your podcast, look back at your calendar again and start placing the most obvious and easiest ones on the ideal dates. For example, your holiday-themed topics will go on or before holidays, or there might be certain special guest appearances that are best placed where they're most relevant to the guest. Like maybe you interviewed an author, so it's best to publish that interview about the time that they have a new book launch, or any kind of entrepreneur probably has some kind of launch coming up. So if you time your release of that episode around that time of the launch. It's a lot more timely and a lot more relevant to your audience. And it will also really help that person that you spoke with if you've timed it around that same time. So they're generating more buzz around their product launch or their service. Also look at what kind of pre-recorded content you can create and release when you'll be away, either taking some time off for a vacation or some travel, or you simply want to have one episode on standby that you could release at any time. Maybe you become sick or there's some emergency, but it's really important for you to get an episode out there. You might be able to do that with very little or no editing or other production because you've already done that and the episode is timeless content. So it's just sitting there waiting for you to publish. I have an episode like that, but I'm finally planning to publish that soon. It's an episode where I interviewed Chris Brogan and we both talked about pet peeves of podcast interviewees. I now have a plan for publishing that episode instead of it simply being a standby episode for when I move or when I get sick or something like that. It is instead going to be part of one of my monthly themes, which will be about interviews in podcasts. And that will be one particular episode, a subdivided topic during that month. Very similar to my previous point about brainstorming your topics and maybe themes for particular months. If you have a straight list of topics or guests, look at that list very carefully and see if there are any themes apparent in that list, or if there are any themes you can come up with by looking at that list. These could tie in with notable holidays, or they could even be just arbitrarily assigned by you to a particular month to say February is interview month or July is Twitter month or anything like that. For example, with the Audacity to Podcast, January 2016 is my New Year month because all of the content I'm releasing during this month is focused on this idea of a new year or the next year of your podcast. It's not necessarily New Year's Day themed, but it is themed thinking about the upcoming year. I did something similar inside of Podcaster Society, is that the special webinar that I did exclusive to members of Podcaster Society is talking about setting up for a great year for your podcast in the upcoming year. And we had some great conversations there about goals and measuring things and a lot more inside of that. And if you're interested, podcastersociety.com. I'll tell you more about something coming up that will be free that you can participate in with that. Sometimes even designating a month as a particular theme will give you more ideas for that month, more content ideas that you might not have thought of on your own, but because you realized, oh, I've got 2 episodes here that kind of follow this particular theme. Can I think of anything else on that theme? And you might be able to do that. It's a great way to stretch yourself and come up with more content along that same theme and content that would be very helpful to your audience and help grow your reputation and deepen that relationship with your audience as well. So this is step 3, organize your episode ideas. Step 4, commit to a schedule. Now that you know what you want to cover and roughly when you want to cover it, you need to look at that calendar again and start figuring out when can you make this happen and how can you make it happen with your time. Really what we're talking about here is budgeting with your time. The same thing should happen when you're going to purchase something, especially big purchases, is you have to figure out where is that money coming from. Sure, you may have the money in your bank, but what is it pulling from in order to pay for that new thing, like a TV, a gaming console, a new car, a new house, new podcasting equipment, whatever it is? That money's coming from somewhere. It's pulling from something. So where is it pulling from? With your time. What are you going to not do in order to do this work on your podcast? Podcasts don't produce themselves, and I think we sometimes forget that. I know I certainly do. I can often think, oh yeah, I'll record so many episodes of my podcast on a particular day. And I get to that day and I realize I have no time to record this many episodes. And it was a failure on my part because I didn't budget for that time. So you need to figure out when you're going to plan that episode, when you're going to record it, and when you're going to edit it. Those are the basic 3 steps to your podcast that take the most time. Your planning and preparation for the episode, the time you actually spend recording that episode, and maybe you need to schedule that with a guest or with a co-host, and then that time that you need to edit the episode and do that post-production stuff to get it ready to schedule to publish. This is especially important if you want to batch your work. Like I mentioned in the previous episode of the Audacity to Podcast, in this coming year, I'm going to try batching my work with the Audacity to Podcast to give me more time in other areas. So what that means for me is I need to figure out when can I focus and record about 4 or 5 episodes of the Audacity to Podcast in one day? Or how can I plan that out so I can fit it all in? Because each episode has been taking me normally 3 hours of preparation to do. Not much post-production because I do contract the editing out. And there is a little bit of post-production, but it's not all that much. So I need to decide, how can I fit in 3 hours of preparation per episode and fit in the recording of those episodes? Or if I'm batching this stuff together, do I even need to do that? Instead, and this is part of the reason why I'm trying batching in this coming year, is with breaking things out into themes and subdividing it, I could hit on a particular inspiration and then come up with 4 different episodes and write the show notes and prepare for those episodes in one single sitting because I'm focused on that single topic. Instead of trying to come up with 4 completely different episodes and switching my brain around between different things, I'm working on 4 episodes simultaneously. And that could also help because I might put a point in the first episode of that month, and then at some point I realize, that point would actually be better in the 4th episode of that month. So I can just switch it around, and I'm still working with that overall monthly content. But where am I going to fit that into my schedule? What will I not do in order to do this new thing? It may not be as much of a switch like that for you or an exchange, but you do need to commit to some kind of schedule if you're going to plan for the upcoming year and stick to that plan. When are you going to plan your episode? When are you going to record it? When are you going to edit it? Yes, batching is helpful toward this, but you don't have to batch. You may have your full plan of all 50 episodes or maybe 300 episodes for the coming year, and you don't plan to batch any of them. That's totally okay. It's up to you whether you batch your production and your recording and all of that stuff. But when are you going to spend the time on these things? If you don't make the time for these things won't happen. You'll find yourself putting it off, and then comes that day when you were supposed to publish an episode and you end up rushing things and it just doesn't come out as well as it could have. So that's why this is step number 4, commit to a schedule. Step number 5, be flexible. Now that you have a plan for your upcoming year for your podcast, and you may even have a schedule of how to make that plan work, it's time to build in some space for mistakes, for sickness, for traveling, for breaking events, and things like that. This margin then can give you more flexibility for change if you need to adjust anything along the way and such, but it also gives you more freedom for leveraging certain time-sensitive opportunities. Like maybe you get to go speak at a conference and you record your session and you realize this recording of my presentation would make a great episode of my podcast. But if you've planned every single episode of your podcast for the next year and you've scheduled it out and everything, where are you going to fit in that great opportunity to share something that you shared to an audience? Well, you could squeeze it in as a special episode, and that might seem a little weird, or it might throw off your publishing schedule. It could mess with certain things unless you have that built-in margin where you can shift things very easily and put that episode in where and how you want it. Sure, you could release it as a special episode, or you could release it as a regular episode and simply shift everything else that you're doing. One simple method to making your podcast more flexible for these kinds of changes is to avoid episode numbers whenever possible. It is easy to change an episode number in text, so you don't have to avoid writing an episode number in your show notes or in your blog post titles or in the text that goes along with your episodes. That's fine. And it may even be easy for you to change the episode number that's in your intro. Like what I've started doing is trying, for the most part, that the only time that I mention my episode number is in the actual intro of my podcast, when I say, welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode number, and then the number there. But if you use your episode numbers for your show notes URLs, that's when it can become a lot more difficult, especially if you're referring to those show notes throughout your episode and you mention those URLs in your episode. Then you can get locked in to making that episode a specific episode number. For example, this episode is going to be episode number 252. But what if I decided to squeeze another episode in between this? Well, throughout this episode, I may have mentioned, look at the show notes at theaudacitytopodcast.com/252, or this is episode 252, or look at the show notes for episode 252. It would be a huge pain to go through and edit all of those mentions of an episode number. So that kind of forces me into squeezing in an episode as something special or bonus, but then it's an unnumbered episode. And for some of us who have OCPD or perfectionism or anything like that, it might start to mess with our brains and we might just not like it, or our audience might not necessarily like receiving an episode on a day they didn't expect, or it might throw them off or confuse them. I'm not saying that it will, it could, but the best thing is to build in that flexibility. What if you needed to shift things around? Or what if you record an episode and you decide this was a great episode to release 2 months from now instead of right now? So staying away from episode numbers as much as possible, especially in your recorded conversation, can really help you to maintain that flexibility so you don't have to go back in and try and edit those things and edit them smoothly. It can be a real pain to try and edit stuff smoothly if you're inserting language into an episode at some point. So this is step 5, be flexible. Again, these 5 steps for how to plan a full year of your podcast are: number 1, plan with a calendar. Number 2, brainstorm an episode list. Number 3, organize your episode ideas. Number 4, commit to a schedule. And number 5, be flexible. How are you going to plan your upcoming year of your podcast? I'd love to hear from you, so please comment on the show notes for this episode at theaudacitytopodcast.com/year plan. I'd also really appreciate if you would share this episode out. Click on the Twitter, Facebook, Google+, Pinterest, whatever buttons there that you'd like to share this out with your followers. I would really appreciate it. And that's a great way that you can help the podcast grow and encourage me as well. Once again, the show notes are at theaudacitytopodcast.com/year plan. Before I tell you about the upcoming free webinar about profiting with your podcast, I'd like to thank Danielle Bean from the United States of America, who left a very kind review for me in iTunes. Danielle said, "Daniel teaches you the basics without ever talking down to you. He's honest and helpful, entertaining and informative. A must listen if you are learning to podcast. I just launched my podcast, Girlfriends, and I'll have a link to that podcast, the Girlfriends podcast, in the show notes for this episode." She said, "I just launched my podcast, Girlfriends, this week and could not have done it without this incredible resource. Thank you, Daniel." Well, thank you, Danielle, for that very kind review. It does really encourage me when I see those reviews in iTunes. And if you'd like to get all of your international podcast reviews sent to you automatically on a regular basis, then go to mypodcastreviews.com. This is the only tool that sends you all of your podcast reviews from all of the iTunes countries and Stitcher and soon Pod Directory, and it gives a lot of other great features and benefits to you as well. Sign up for a free or premium plan over at mypodcastreviews.com. The one thing I wanted to tell you about before I go is that I have an upcoming free webinar on January 28th. Already, this is looking like it'll be a really popular webinar. This is a Podcaster Society webinar, but it will be free and open to the public. I'll be having the real Brian from ProfitCast to join me for a podcasting webinar where we will talk about podcasting profit. And profit, here's a little spoiler, isn't only about making money from your podcast. We'll be talking about all aspects of profiting from your podcast because I really do believe every podcast must have profit to it. You'll have to come to the webinar to learn more about why that is and how to generate that profit, depending on what kind of profit your podcast needs. To sign up for that, visit podcasterssociety.com/webinar, or I have a link to it in the show notes for this episode at theaudacitytopodcast.com/year plan. I'd love to have you at that webinar. This will be part of Podcaster Society, but it's open to the public, and even the replay will be available for a very short time after the webinar airs. But if you want access to this webinar, as well as all of the other great webinars we've done for Podcaster Society, then look at joining podcasterssociety.com. This is our elite community of podcasters about podcasting, helping you to grow and improve your podcast in your content, presentation, production, promotion, and profit. We have weekly webinars, a private community, real-time conversations, and much more. So go to podcasterssociety.com/webinar to register for that webinar and also to get more information about Podcaster Society in case you'd like to join. But even if you're not interested in joining Podcaster Society, I'd love to see you in that free webinar on Thursday, January 28th, 2016 at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go to podcasterssociety.com/webinar to register for that, and I have that link in the show notes as well. Please comment on the show notes for this episode, share this episode out with your friends and family, and let me know, how are you planning for your upcoming year of podcasting? Go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/year plan to share and comment on this episode, and I would really appreciate that. If you'd like to have me help you with your podcast or have any questions about podcasting, all of my contact information is on the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com, as well as in the show notes for this episode. Very soon, I'll be publishing my videos from CES 2016, and I'm looking forward to that. Got some great video interviews out there with some great products and companies. So make sure that you subscribe to my video channels on iTunes as well as on YouTube, and those links are also at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our award-winning and award-nominated podcasts to make you think, laugh, and succeed at noodle.mx. The Audacity to Podcast is also a proud member of the Tech Podcast Network. If